As one might expect for a pair of sisters who had spent a fair bit of their childhood living in a vehicle, moving along the front line of free festival DIY culture, Jessie and Rena's advice for their own contemporary age group on the difficult question of drink and drugs was as spot on and experience-based as their equally appropriate ideas about diet, meat and overall agricultural sustainability.
I think everything should be taken in moderation.
Right.
So like you wouldn't drink 10 pints of lager, would you?
No.
And it wouldn't go out and take tennies, you know what I mean?
So you think people have sort of oversaturised a little bit?
Yeah, do you know what I mean? People think it's
They're
hard.
sort of naturally chilling out now with the stuff.
People think it's hard to go, I took tennies last night, you know what I mean?
That's just amusing it, really.
Do you know what I mean? You take halves, you like it, you know what I mean? It's the way it's got to be. You have a good time and not overdo it and spin out on the floor. Like half the young kids are doing that these days.
These media-conditioned binge-drinking youngsters from Tony Blair's own County Durham political power base, filmed more than a decade after Jessie and Rena's appearance at the Dome in North London's Tufnell Park, on the other hand, have none of the creative drive, artistic appreciation or wider cultural experience of our two then up-and-coming underground DJs. 10 years of continued media dumbing down the rise of celebrity culture, supermarkets and off-licences awash with readily available cheap booze and a buy now pay later attitude of acquiring everything on tick have created a society in which, to youngsters like these, an aimless existence of binge drinking is looked upon as normal behaviour, in spite of the health warnings on the brand name beer cans and the nanny state recommendations for a sensible unit-based methodology as part of a well-managed intake of alcohol. Perhaps they could learn a lesson or two from Jessie and Rena, or perhaps they've been dumbed down onto such a level of stupidity that anything like that would be beyond them. Who are we to say? Given the ever-rising levels of teenage alcohol dependency, perhaps it is something a little more than coincidence that Graham Bright, whose own Fixed Penalties Act was to exert a not inconsiderable level of influence upon Michael Howard's CJA, was to have extensive links to the powerful parliamentary Brewers Group, as well as their political lobbyists, Ian Greer Associates. It is statistical fact that rave culture generally, and the outdoor aspect of the scene in particular, was to result in a tremendous loss of revenue for the breweries, and this, as much as anything else, could be seen as being amongst the principal motivations for the political establishment, and the Tories in particular, wanting to outlaw it. In the 1970s, the rise of free festival culture had been responsible for a similar effect being felt by brewery-owned pub venues, many of which were only to be saved by the timely arrival of punk rock. Thus, in certain definite respects, the suppression of the Stonehenge Free Festival and the draconian measures made law by Michael Howard's Criminal Justice Bill the best part of a decade later could be seen as two cross-generational cycles in the same ultimate campaign to engender political and economic conformity. It is also significant that previous to the Fixed Penalties Act, which appears to have largely been aimed at neutralising the threat posed to the interests of the powerful Bedfordshire brewing dynasty of Whitbread by the Luton-based Exodus Collective, little appears to have been done to outlaw the organisation of unlicensed rave parties. Indeed, the whole ethos of the early ecstasy-based rave scene, which grew out of the so-called Summer of Love at the end of the 1980s, had been of a wholly consumer-oriented hedonistic nature in terms of its overall ideological viewpoint, and was therefore of little or no threat to the all-pervading monetarist ideology of Thatcherism. Whereas in the past all previous youth movements had been anti-establishment in their general outlook and nature, to start with, mainstream rave culture had manifested a brand name-centred fake alternative to the cultural norm, with the only additional feature being a drug-oriented consumerism as opposed to a drink-oriented one. Taking these last few points into account then, it is worth noting that in the run-up to the CJB actually becoming law and enforceable on the street, mainstream banking moved into mainstream counterculture, much as the corporate music business had done with many of the musical participants in the earlier Summer of Love of the 1960s. Perhaps the most interesting manifestation of this last cited phenomenon was the allegedly clandestine connection between Rothschild Finance and Dream Records, a key player in the weekly London club event Megatripolis, as the CJB drove the underground party scene out of the warehouses and into the corporate-owned nightclubs of the city centres. The breweries and big business fat cats were laughing all the way to the bank. Thus, the big-time ecstasy dealers of the late 1980s were able to legitimise themselves completely by buying their way into the consumerist mainstream by setting up record and t-shirt companies on the back of their own illicit criminal earnings. Perhaps the most high-profile manifestation of the corporate legitimisation of the 80s rave scene was Elephant and Castle's Ministry of Sound. Owned by the high-flying super-rich son of the Conservative Arts Minister Lord Palumbo, the venue was to be scandalised by the criminal involvements of its door staff. Located in the shadow of some of the roughest housing estates in South London, pop stars, actors, politicians and media celebrities would rub shoulders with top-level underworld faces in a fashion reminiscent of the Cray and Richardson associations with Barbara Windsor and Judy Garland during the 1960s. Unlike Spiral Tribe and Exodus, however, the sports car and cocaine set from the ministry were to pose little threat to the overtly Thatcherite Conservative Party establishment. Needless to say, in spite of alleged associations with the Richardsons, very little seems to have happened by way of criminal sanctions with respect to this aspect of rave culture, and in spite of the proven links between the ministry and organised criminals from South Africa. Indeed, the clearly monetarist aspect of the late 80s rave scene, in contrast to its more grungy anti-authoritarian DIY culture counterpart, was perhaps an influence upon why it took so long for the establishment to organise some sort of a crackdown upon dance culture in general. Basically, in Thatcher's Britain, the political elite only really seemed to be concerned with how much money you actually had, rather than how you actually acquired it. A policy continued into the millennium by the South Bank New Labour elite of Mackay and Mandelson, whose links to Palumbo Jr. are well documented. Under the Tories, the exploitation of what, in terms of the music business, had in the 1960s been at the forefront of free-thinking and utopian idealism, was to result in yet a further erosion of the means by which the radical political element within the counterculture could articulate its viewpoint legitimately. As the Criminal Justice Bill made the organising of underground rave parties in disused warehouses and similarly non-commercial venues illegal, the farming out of more traditional music venues, such as what was once the Acklam Hall in Notting Hill's Portobello Road, at that time only recently renamed Subterranea, to the Mean Fiddler Group, by then a corporate music industry conglomerate, made it ever more difficult for up-and-coming young bands with a genuine political message to get their foot on the initial rung of success. It was here, after all, that the most commercially successful band of the original first-generation wave of punk rock, The Clash, had played when virtually unknown. And to add insult to injury, the Subterranea Acklam Hall deal was effectively just another manifestation of the ongoing family silver public sector sell-off begun by the Tories and continued under New Labour. Thus, the voice of the radical counterculture alternative was silenced, and in its place a bland, homogeneous, EMAP-manipulated muzak churned out by the corporate rock business sponsors of Tony Blair's one-time musical collaborator, Mark Ellen. Elsewhere, in the back streets and housing estates of the poor, as a means of suppressing still further any chance of the street-level formulation of some newfound means of dissent, negative media imagery amongst the blaxploitation element of hip-hop dance culture in particular was to create a socially engineered fear of crime, itself effectively manipulated by the state by means of a mainstream media output dominated by a vacuous, dumbed-down negativity advocating a dog-eat-dog society void of any genuine community spirit or sense of conscience or morality. In a world where culture and counterculture alike are singing from the same exploitative monetarist hymn sheet, there is little room for anti-capitalist dissent. The overall effect of this essential hijacking of the counterculture by this self-same exploitative capitalist mindset, which the formulators of the radical alternative had originally sought to subvert, is that now, after more than a decade of New Labour panderings to the same market forces that had originally been espoused by the Tories for the best part of the previous 20 years, another socio-economic collapse has taken place, almost as devastating as the one experienced in the 1930s. Here in London's Notting Hill Gate, in the spring of 1994, I tracked down a well-respected member of the black community whose involvements with the early hip-hop scene in Ladbroke Grove were to lead him to draw similar conclusions to my own with regard to the effective social engineering of the hip-hop scene in particular and the counterculture in general.